Welcome back, fellow designers. For all those of you that have, seen the last episode where I talked about variabilization of UI widgets, I want to acknowledge, your answers and your engagement. It's been really phenomenal, and also your responses. So, what I want to do in this episode is I'm going to focus on experiences. Last time we looked at how we're going to design widgets using variabilization, but this time we will talk about how we're going to design user experiences using variabilization. Right? Now, one of the questions that you might have is, well, why do we care about variabilization? Why should we do variabilization? And it's really important for you to understand in design, there is no single perfect answer. So, you might have a solution that doesn't work for a certain context, but then, for some other context, that solution is awesome. And I think that is something that you want to recognize. And that's what variabilization does, is it helps you decide under what circumstances a solution would work and would not work. Okay. And if you were to approach this from a variabilization perspective, you become very, very effective as a UX designer. Now, of course, the next one after this, I will talk about how to use variabilization to do your portfolio or even an interview task. But for now, let's get going on experiences. And thank you very much, guys. Let's go on to the next slide, please. All right. So I'm just going to do a quick recap. Whenever you're variabilizing, there are three things you need to do. The first thing, define your objectives. Second thing, identify your variables. And the third thing, evaluate the solutions and figure out what is the best solution for the objectives that you set for yourself. And also keep in mind, your objectives will define a lot of things that will happen downstream. So make sure you do your objectives correctly. Let's go on to the next slide. So let's look at something as simple as a login experience. I mean, most of us basically look at it and say, yeah, login experience, how hard can it be? Just put a user ID and password. And today we're going to talk about all the different ways login experiences work. And I will also tell you how a certain company solved the login experience and made a multi-billion-dollar industry out of it. So we will talk about how user experience can create multiples of multi-billion-dollar opportunities. So let's go on to the next slide. All right, so let's define our objectives. At the very highest level, our objectives are, well, who's our audience? Our audience is somebody who's shopping. Okay, this person is fairly busy. They're very familiar with technology, but they're worried about entering the correct information. They don't want to spend a lot of time worrying about login. They just want to get in and purchase. So they want to make sure that they're entering the correct information. And from a website perspective, you want to get their credentials, so user credentials. And the context is that this person wants to log in and purchase something. The constraints, well, it's fairly standard. They want to make a purchase either on a desktop or a mobile device. So when you stop to think about what the user goals are, and again, it's really important for us to say, what is the business goal? Because it's a business that's paying us our salary. So the user goal is to reduce effort, and the business goal is to get the job done as quickly as possible. Because when you delay, you are losing business. And so you want to make sure that this is as frictionless as possible. So with that context in mind, let's go on to the next slide. All right. Now let's look at the variables. Now the variables there are two different components of variables. The first part is, well, what are the variables from the user perspective? And the second aspect is, well, what are the variables from the technical perspective? So how many different ways can you solve the problem technically? And then, well, how many different ways can a user come to use your product? So we want to understand what the difference is between the user as well as the technical aspects, and then bridge the gap. So let's first stop and think about, well, what are the variables? And so again, if you were to do it, you may find different variables again for your context. But again, this is not a complete list of variables, but this is a good start. Let's look at the first thing as frequency of use. So most users might either use the product rarely, or sometimes, or frequently. All right. Now let's look at the next aspect, accuracy. Well, how much accuracy do you need when you're entering in your user ID and password? Now you might be surprised, because some of you might think, well, when you're entering your user ID and password, you have to be accurate all the time. But not necessarily. So you might be surprised about it. So I'll tell you what, think about this, and I will give you a use case where you do not have to be accurate when you're logging in. And so stay tuned for that one. But yes, so how accurate do you need to be for logging in? The next step is, what is the risk? So let us say if the wrong person got in to access your system, well, what is the risk? So you could have a medium risk or a low risk or a high risk, or potentially even a super high risk where, let's say you have a bunch of Bitcoin, or it's like your bank account, everything gets wiped, you are in trouble. So you might have a super high risk profile at that time. Now, the next aspect when you look at it is effort. Well, how much effort does the user expect to put in? Is it, effort can be measured in terms of the amount of information that needs to be entered, or it can also be the number of steps that need to be taken to kind of complete the task, or it is also the amount of workload somebody might feel when they have to remember a certain password. And so these are all elements that you think about in terms of effort. Now, I'm going to jump on to the second part where we look at the technical components of it. So let's look at it. Okay, before we get into the technical component, let's just very quickly look at all these numbers. So from a combinatorial perspective, there are 216 unique ways that you can have users, or 316 different types of user mindsets that are coming in to use a product. Now, of course, not all of them will work every time, but the number is 216. Now, keep that in mind as we start talking about the technical variables. Let's go to the technical variable. Now, when you look at the technical variables, you can have multiple kinds of devices, multiple types of form factors. It could be mobile, desktop, tablet, or it could even be, a console on your automobile. So you could have a lot of different kinds of devices. Let's look at the other variables. The next one is identifier. Well, how would you identify yourself to the system? How would they know who you are? So it could be a username, or it could be your email, or it could be a telephone number, or in some cases, you might not even have an identifier. So that's an interesting one. Now, let's go on to the next one. And if you're looking at authenticator, so you might give in your user ID, but your password in that case is your authenticator. So what tells the system that you are who you are? So an authenticator could be a one-time password, or a password, or a security question. It could be even biometrics, or in some cases, you might not even have an authenticator. And probably there's also another interesting variation where you might have third-party authenticators that are coming in. So, well, you might have like a Google login or a Facebook login. That's a third-party authenticator that's authenticating your access. And then finally, when you look at the other aspect, which is, well, how are you authenticating? Is it a single factor authentication where you just put in a user ID and password and you log in, or do you have a multi-factor login? So where you might have a user ID, password, and an OTP or some other identification that helps you get in there. And so when you start looking at all of these technical variables, and if you had to design a system just purely from a technical perspective, and you look at it from a combinatorial perspective, you are looking at approximately about 300, not approximately, but at about 337 unique ways that you can design a system using all of these variables, right? So now that you've identified the variables, now let's look at a lot of different types of login experiences and say, well, what were the variables that were driving those different logins? And I think the one thing I absolutely want all of you to get out of this class is to really understand there is no perfect answer in design. It's always a best solution for the problem at hand, and you will have side effects for that solution, but that's what it is. So you're basically trying to find the most appropriate solution, and for that situation, and there may be other solutions that may be better for other situations. Let's go on to the next slide. So here are a bunch of examples that you look in the wild. So simple, you look at LinkedIn, user ID, password. It's a very standard type of login. You might even have a login experience that looks like WhatsApp, where you just simply type in your telephone number and you get in. And you have third-party logins, and you might even have an authentication system where you're giving your fingerprint, or on your car, you're punching in a series of numbers that kind of gives you access, unique access. Or you can also look at the other login where you're continuing as a guest. So you don't have to give in your user ID and password. You just enter and you kind of do your business. You're also looking at multi-factor logins where Google might actually give you different passwords that change every 30 seconds or so. And then you're kind of entering that. So that way you are ensuring that you have the correct access. And you might have OTPs that go into your phones or your emails, and therefore there are a lot of different examples that you would see in the wild. So I'm going to start taking some examples of experiences, and let's start breaking it down. So let's go to the next one. Okay, now before we do that, I really do want to talk about why we are doing this. So our goal, and we are supported by UX Reactor and NB Healthcare Technologies, and they are, and we help them hire and develop the best talent for them. And so they are supporting us so that we can reach out to you, and we can also help you find a place where you're appreciated and your career grows. So again, this is one of the reasons why we do that, is to help companies recruit and hire the best talent. So let's go on to the next slide. So let's look at some of the evaluations, the solutions. And so let's look at a basic generic browser-based login. So if somebody was basically logging in, with a user ID and password, frequency, from a frequency perspective, you could either be a rare user or sometimes, or frequent, doesn't matter. The frequency of use doesn't matter. However, accuracy matters, so you want it to be accurate. And the risk is generally medium. It's not, there is some risk to it but at the same time, it's not so high that it's going to stop, your bank account or put you on the streets or something like that. So there is some risk. And then in terms of an effort, usually it's medium to low, will probably involve some level of load, cognitive load, to remember the password. So at a very high level, generally, a generic browser-based login, you're talking about 18 possible types of users or scenarios for users where this kind of a login would apply. Now let's go on to the technical aspects. Right now, where would you apply this kind of login experience? So you're probably looking at either a mobile desktop or tablet. Again, because you have to type in, because it's typing specific, you want to make sure that you have a big enough keyboard to type it in, which is where, when you look at automotives or a household console, it might not be the best solution. Identifiers, absolutely, you need identifiers. And again, this is probably one of the most inclusive ways, with the exception of biometrics and implicit log authenticators. It pretty much applies to everything, and it is a single factor login experience. So when you're looking at it, there are probably 49 possible technical variables that would apply to a generic browser-based login. So if you were to kind of go in and you look at the problem of logging in, you would say, well, you want something that's familiar and convenient. That's awesome. This is a simple way to do it. And again, you're looking at the form factors and the user mindsets, and this works pretty much most of the use cases. But the one negative is, if somebody is not a frequent user of this application, they might forget their credentials. And so there is a challenge with, there's a technical challenge with helping somebody recover their password, as well as there is a challenge with a user, because if a user does not remember the password, there's a risk that they might abandon your product. And so those are things that you want to keep in mind as you're looking at a generic login experience. Let's go on to the next one. So let's look at, when would you do an OTP-based login? And so when you're thinking about OTP, you usually want to use OTP when you do not want people to remember, right? And so essentially you're looking at frequency of use is maybe sometimes or rare, because again, if you want to do an OTP all the time, let's say I was logging into my Gmail, and every time I logged in, you wanted me to check my OTP, or, it's just going to be a hassle, because I really don't want to check my OTP every time. But for those situations where it's rare and it's sometimes, and people don't want to remember or cannot remember their password, OTP actually works. Accuracy is good, yes. And then when you're looking at the risk, it's low or medium. You really do not have to worry about the risk as much, because even if somebody got in, that's fine. But the assumption here is that if you were getting an OTP, only you had access to that device that was receiving the OTP, or you had access to the email account that was receiving. So that's the underlying assumption, but that holds true for most cases. But even if it doesn't, the risk is low to medium, and the effort is low, because you really don't have to think about anything else. So let's look at the technical component. So there are 4 ways that you can think about 4 user scenarios where an OTP-based login would apply. Now, if you look at the technical variables, again, mobile, desktop, tablet works really well. OTP, you just want to have an identifier, but you really don't care about the authenticator because the authenticator is coming to your device. And then it's a single factor, or potentially it could be multi-factor, but for now we're looking at a single factor model. So there's 6 technical implementations of this OTP-based login. And so when you look at it, this is where it is. So, one of the most famous OTP-based logins is WhatsApp. And that's a really awesome way to do it. But the thing is, the pros are obviously you don't need to remember your password. You can use this again and again, and you don't, it's fairly easy to use. However, if let's say your phone network was down or your email was down, you would be in trouble. You would not be able to access in a timely manner. So that's something you would need to think about it. And coming back to something that I talked about last time, I said, well, here's a company, WhatsApp, that basically grew its customer base to a few 100 million users within like months, right? Within like dozens of months, and were able to get acquired for a few $1 billion just because they solved the login experience, right? And again, you might think login is a fairly dry, people don't care about it, but really just because they solved the login experience, and of course they solved the other component of adding their contacts in automatically, they were able to increase their valuation to, multiples of billions of dollars just by solving that problem. So again, goes back to say, no problem is small for a designer. Let's go on to the next slide. Okay, now let's think about a global authentication. So when you're thinking about a global authentication, you might actually say, well, these are, you would use it when you're not using the app on a regular basis. Your frequency is either rare or sometimes your accuracy is yes. There is some risk. So you still want to make sure that it's a correct, appropriate person. So there is medium to high risk involved, but you do not want to put in a lot of effort, right? So there are 4 different possible use cases from a user perspective where it would apply. Let's go on to the other side, the technical component. And again, when you're looking at global, again, this is where you're using Gmail, your Gmail Google Authenticator, or you're using your Facebook Authenticator. These are fairly easy. And again, it could be any one of the mobile, desktop, or tablets, and then you're using a third-party global authenticator, and it could be a single or multi-factor authentication. There are 7 technical implementations of the same thing, right? Let's go on to the next thing. Now, this is a fairly simple process. Now, this is again where, you don't need to create credentials. You want to, get people, no need to sign up. You're directly in. It's very, very convenient. But the challenge is it depends on having a stable global account. There's also privacy concerns because who knows what about you, right? And that is something that you need to think about from a customer's perspective. And one of the other problems that I've seen with global authentication systems is the risk of confusion, because you might have created an account with your Google system, but then you forgot about it. And afterwards you create a LinkedIn account. And after that, you might actually create something with Twitter. And now you don't know, you're worried, like, why is your information not showing up every time you log in? That's probably because you've logged in using multiple applications. And that's a huge risk, because then users do not actually get to be sticky with your product. It's harder to make it sticky. So you need to kind of solve that problem when you're doing the global authentication login. Let's go on to the next one. Oh yeah, here's another one. Now this one is kind of interesting, where Apple automatically generates your passwords and your credentials and logs you in, and you really don't have to worry about it. All you need to do is you need to authenticate yourself to Apple and say, hey, I'm who I am. As long as Apple knows who you are, they're going to be the intermediary, and they're going to introduce you to every other product that comes out there. So you do not really have to worry about it. Now, this is interesting because this is 2 types of login. The first one, it's a global authentication, but the second one, it's also implicit, because Apple is creating all your credentials, all of that stuff behind, without you having to worry about it. So there's an implicit login process that's happening there is that you are not worried about. So it's an implicit login experience as well as a global authentication experience. So let's go on to the next one. All right, now let's look at multi-factor authentication. So again, when you're doing multi-factor authentication, you might be, rare sometimes, might also be frequent, if you think about it. Accuracy, absolutely yes, because you want to ensure it is the same person, and the risk is high or probably super high. When you're looking at the effort, there is medium to high effort across the board. So you might have information that needs to be entered is medium, but the number of steps is high. So these are again things that the users would want to, their willingness to solve the problem or their willingness to go through the system. So when you look at this context, there are 4 different ways that users, or 4 different use cases for users to use this. When you look at the technical aspects, again, you have the standard login process, but on top of that, you have a multi-factor authentication. So you're talking about 24 possible technical implementations of the same. Now, let's look at some examples. So here's a multi-factor authentication where, Google, where you enter user ID and password, and then it'll tell you like, hey, give me your, give me your OTP or give me your Google Authenticator code that changes every 30 seconds, and you kind of put it in and you go in. So the pros are absolutely security rocks it. However, the challenge is it's going to be lengthy and you need to have access. The assumption is the user has access to the authentication device so that you're able to use the device whenever you need to authenticate. So this is something that's really, really important. Let's go on to the next slide. So, okay, now this is multi-factor. So again, when you're looking at multi-factor, these are situations where you might apply when the risk is super high. So let's say you're accessing your financial accounts, or you're doing something that will cause irreparable damage if something was not to work, or if the wrong person got access to the product. And so you have a super high risk profile, and you're willing to put in the effort to kind of take care of it. And so there are 4 possible situations in which users would want to use this kind of a experience. Now let's look at the technical variables. So when you look at the technical variables, again, you're going to have the same thing. You're going to have devices, identifiers, and you're looking at multi-factor implementation. So you're talking, and again, because it's 3-factor, you have, you have maybe a password, then you have an OTP and maybe something else when you're doing the transaction. So you're talking about 36 possible technical implementations of the same experience. So again, let's look at an experience where this works. And so this is one where, and this is something people may not realize, because CAPTCHA is also an authentication mechanism. So one of the reasons I put there was we kind of tend to look at CAPTCHA and kind of ignore it, not think about it. But a lot of applications say, you know what, I really don't want to talk to a machine. I want to make sure you're a human being, and you get the CAPTCHA. And so that is the first level of authentication that says, well, are you human or not? And then you're probably authenticating with your user ID, password, and then you're basically saying, okay, I'm going to get an OTP. And once you get the OTP, you are verified and logged in. So this is an interesting way to do it. And this usually happens when you're looking at, in India, it's called the Aadhaar card. For those of you that are not in India, it is the equivalent of a social security number, where all your government documents and all your other information is stored. So you want to make sure that, the system is hack-proof, while at the same time, it is providing the support that the citizen needs at any point in time. So the pros are, security is taken care of. The cons are, it's a lengthy process. It's a lengthier than necessary. But again, if you go back to the user expectations, they really expect it to be, a high effort. And so there's no issue with this. So let's go on to the next slide. So let's look at, is it possible to have no authentication, right? Now, when you do no authentication, the reason why you might not want to have any authentication is because you want to give a very quick experience to somebody without, and help people try and get value out of your product as quickly as possible. So in those kinds of scenarios, you're talking, it's a rare use. You want to be accurate somehow. The risk is low to medium. There's no cost associated with it, and the effort is low. People do not expect to put in a lot of effort as they're coming in. So really, there are about two possible ways of doing this. So let's go on to the next slide. So you're looking at the technical variables. Here is where the interesting stuff happens. When you're authenticating, there might possibly be an implicit authentication that is happening where you don't have to do a password or whatever, but it could be something like, I sent you an email, click on the link on that email and get back in. So it's implicitly you are kind of being authenticated without you having to kind of remember something or put some information in. Factor is single factor. And there are 16 possible technical implementations of this login experience. So let's go on to the next slide. Now, here is an example where, and this is an example which, when it was first implemented, it basically helped the company get $200 million more incrementally in revenue for that year. And the simple thing that they did was they just said, hey, just continue as a guest. And this is where, when you're buying your airline tickets or you're trying to buy, on e-commerce or whatever, traditionally people would ask you for your login and password, but a lot of times, people may not want to give that. So they say, that's fine. I have your credit card information. So I kind of am authenticating you. So just continue on as a guest. And what that did was it reduced the friction of logging in or signing up for an account, and immediately had significant financial gains for the company. And, the pros are it's a faster process. But however, the cons are you may not know enough about the customer to fully leverage and market to that individual or to build a relationship with that individual. But again, my thought is, if somebody is buying an airline ticket, say probably like 4 times a year, I don't think we need to force them to remember the password. Just get them, help them buy the ticket, get them traveling, and that's a good enough beginning to the relationship. So again, here's another example where just thinking about the login experience created significant profits and economic opportunities for the company that executed it. So again, no problem is a small problem for a designer. Let's go on to the next one. Okay, now remember I said, well, is it possible? Well, actually, no, this is not that one. But when you're looking at no authentication, so in what cases would you apply no authentication? Usually, you would apply no authentication when people are using your product very, very frequently. A common example, your Gmail or your email that you use online, you might want to check your email maybe multiple times in a day. So you don't want to really be, burdened by, proving who you are every time. You just want to read the messages. And so the frequency of use is usually frequent or sometimes, but frequent, more or less frequent. Accuracy, yes, absolutely. You want to know that person. But the risk or the perceived risk that the user has in their mind is low, and the effort that they want to put in is low, because if they're gonna, these things add up. Because if I'm going to log into my email 5 or 10 times a day, the effort is going to add up. So when you look at the variables or from a user perspective, there are 4 possible ways that you can, or 4 possible use cases when the user would want to use this. Now let's look at the technical components. So here you're basically saying doesn't really matter what device, with the exception of a text. And then you're basically saying the identifier, you really don't need an identifier, because once the person is logged in, you are not going to force them to log in again and again. So it's an implicit authentication, because you probably put a cookie or you're somehow identifying that individual on the other side, and therefore there's implicit authentication that's happening. And it's a single factor authentication. So there are 12 possible technical implementations of the solution. So let's look at an example. So here's an example where somebody says, hey, you're already logged in, let's continue. Or when you go into your Amazon account, and Amazon might log you out every 30 days or whatever certain period of time, but within that time frame, you can go back anytime and you're already logged in. So that's great. So the pros are it's faster, and usually e-commerce gets the most benefit out of these kinds of systems. The risk is, you don't know when you're going to get hacked, right? And that's a huge problem. So there's a risk of unanticipated hacks, and the challenge is, somebody else might decide to log in and send a threatening, email to your friends, or, do something inappropriate with your account. So again, people could use your systems when you're not there, and that's a huge risk. But again, as long as the customers or the users don't really think about that problem, or they're not worried about that problem, then this is a solution that works for them. Let's go on to the next one. So here's one where you also have, no authentication. So let's say you're doing something, and in which case you just want to continue your survey. You don't have to really worry about it. So your information is stored, your partial information is stored. When you come back, it says, hey, I noticed you didn't complete it. Do you want to continue? That's good. Or you want to restart? And so that works. Again, these are also used when, the risk of somebody else coming in and filling the information is low. Doesn't matter. Faster process. Again, same issues, unanticipated hacks. Let's go on to the next one. Okay. Now let's look at this one where you only have an identifier, right? And if you want, where this is generally used when you don't really have to worry that much about security. You do care about accuracy, and then when you're looking at the frequency of use, it could be rare, sometimes or frequent, doesn't matter. So the 6 different use cases where it might apply. Now let's look at the technical aspects. So when you look in the technical components, again, there are about 36 different ways that you can implement the solution. So let's go on to the next slide. So when you do an identifier only, so this is an example where, you're just coming in and you just submit your information and you're on. So it's this classic example might be, and this is generally used when the facilities are controlled, right? Where all the variables are controlled. And so you're kind of making sure that the only an authorized person is in the correct place. So for example, this might be used in hospitals where, the doctor walks into the patient examining room, and they're basically saying, hey, I am who I am. So they might just enter their employee ID, and they have access to the whole system. Right. Or it might also be a situation where, let's say, you are trying to enter your office and you just put in your fingerprint biometric, and then that's just an identifier you're moving through. So again, the idea here is it's a faster process, but everything needs to be in control. But the cons are, of course, if things are not in control, then you have the risk of unanticipated hacks. So you need to be thinking about that. Let's go on to the next slide, please. So this is one where you have an authenticator only. So where, again, when you're looking at an authenticator only, the frequency of use is frequent. The accuracy, yes, you absolutely want the accuracy, and then the risk is high or super high. But then, if you want to remember, yes, there is a lot of workload in terms of remembering the information. But otherwise, the information to be entered or the actions that could be low. You don't really have to have a lot of steps. So there's 6 different use cases where it could apply. From a technical perspective, again, there are 18 ways that you can implement this. Let's go to the next slide. So here's a simple example where you're basically saying, yeah, I'm going to use my mobile device. And I heard this insane metric somewhere where it said the average user picks up their phone 2,000 times a day. Now, again, when you're talking at that level of frequency, you really don't want to put in a lot of information. Just put in your thumbprint, you're ready to go. Or you're probably, using your car a lot. Just put in your code. You don't really need to worry about your keys and all that stuff. You're good to go. So again, it's fairly fast, but again, there are security risks with unanticipated situations. But again, as long as the users do not perceive this as a high-risk scenario, it works. Let's go on to the next one. Now, this is the one question that I'd asked you, like, is it possible for a use case where accuracy is not important, right? And for those of you that kind of, guessed it, the answer is when you use your emails, right? So sometimes when you're trying to access your email, you forgot your password. Some of these products might actually say, hey, do you remember a password that you used in the past, right? And you put in the password that you used in the past, and it lets you log in. And so that's exactly the use case where Accuracy is probably not very high. However, the risk is low, and so you get access to those systems. So again, frequency of use in this case is rare because you probably forgot. However, the product is reducing the accuracy requirements in exchange for low risk and low effort and getting the job done. So there's one use case where it would work potentially that way. And the technical variables, there are about 6 potential technical applications for this specific use case. Let's go to the next slide. So this is an example that we've seen. There's a Just Dial is a product where you really do not need to have an account, or even Craigslist is a really good product from that perspective, where you go in, you enter your telephone number or your email, and you get a message to your telephone number, email, and you continue on your business with that product. So you really do not need to authenticate. And you probably do not expect going back on a regular basis. You're probably going back, say, once or twice in 5 or 6 months. So it doesn't really matter. So this is where, it's a very transactional kind of an experience. You have an immediate need, you go to the product, you don't need to remember anything else, use the product, move on, forget about it. And next time you use it, you might want to give a different telephone number, different email, it still works, no issues. And there are no continuity issues here. So I think the point here is, when the pros are, it's convenient, you don't need to use a different platform, and also you don't need the other company to know or remember who you are. You're just looking at those micro transactions. So that's where it is. The cons are, sometimes it gets hard because you now have so many different systems in place that you were wondering, like, hey, did you send my email? Is it in spam? What's going on? So there are lots of different nuances to, verifying people. And so there's more complexity in the moment, but if you're able to solve it, that's great. So that's 8 experiences that talk about different ways. And again, the main thing that I want people to take away is, in design, there is really no perfect answer. Right? And so every answer works in a different context. And as long as you understand the context and the variables that play out in those contexts, you can really design good and awesome solutions that work for your customer. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, now let's go back to the original problem that we had presented. So in the original problem that we presented, the context was, you want the users to enter their correct details, and it needs to be done as quickly as possible. So if you had that problem, how many different ways would you consider, would you think about your variables? So if you go to the next slide, you'll realize there's 16 possible use cases where you would apply this, and there are 18 possible technical implementations of it, right? And then as you start applying those solutions, you'll realize that there's only a small set of solutions that would work. So the simplest ones that would work is if somebody is really frequent, they're frequently logging in and stuff like that. You ideally want to have, somebody logging in with their user ID password get through, because they remember their passwords and all of that is stored, or potentially even having a session continue on without them having to worry about it. That's where the frequency works. So there are 2 possible solutions. I've only shown you one in the screen, but there are 2 possible solutions there. And then if you were to use this product rarely, you might just possibly send them an OTP, get the verification, get them logged in, and let them get going with the purchase. And so both of these use cases, or all 3 of these solutions, would solve the problem for speed while also ensuring for accuracy. So hopefully you guys kind of understood the way this whole system worked. And again, it might seem like variabilization is overly complex and stuff like that, but it's an important skill for you to learn as a designer, because the more you learn to variabilize, the more you learn to think about it from a systematic perspective, the less time you're going to take to design experiences and solutions, because you kind of are already thinking about the problem from a very holistic perspective. And this is the difference between somebody who, who doesn't really have a lot of experience, hasn't really thought about a lot of these variables. They're coming in, they might spend like 3 or 4 days solving it. Whereas, if you understood the variables and you kind of been following a very systematic approach to it, you might just solve this problem in a matter of hours or minutes, and you kind of move on to the next one. So that's the difference between being productive and being a rock star. So I think that's the main thing that I want to take away from here. Let's go to the next slide. So that said, this ends today's session. The next session, we're going to be talking about how you're going to do your portfolio and how you're going to do your interview task. And again, the same technique, variabilization, how you're going to do your variabilization to decide what kind of portfolio you need to create, and how you're going to approach your different interview tasks. And again, that's going to be really, really fun because I know a lot of you are interested in that. But again, if you just variabilization is one of those skills, you just practice it, and you get really good at it over time. So that's what it is. So here's a challenge for all of you. What if I asked you to design a login experience for a bank account? So the context is you want people to have the correct, you want people to make sure they're entering the correct details. However, the business goal is you want to make sure that there is high security in the process. So what kind of a login experience would you create, right? So for those of you that are new, that haven't subscribed, or I encourage you to subscribe and click on the bell icon, because we are going to be creating a lot of this content. And again, our goal is to demystify UX and make it universally available for all of you. So if you are subscribed and you're getting notifications, you get to know as soon as we put a new video on this channel, so you get to see what's going on. So thank you very much, guys. See you next time.